All right. So my name is Anya Samek. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm here on sabbatical at Chicago this year. And I'm going to give you a little introduction to the Science of Philanthropy initiative and the work that we're doing. If you are a researcher, you will get a sense of the new research that we'll be interested in pursuing. If you are a practitioner, you'll get a very short primer to the types of talks that you may get to see today. And then we have two great speakers who will follow me. One is Terry Zhu, and then we have Michael Price, who's a co-PI of our project. So why would you think that economists are interested in charitable fundraising? Whenever I meet someone and tell them I'm an economist, they usually want to know what I think about the stock market and where we should invest. And so we have this idea that economists are money maximizers. But in fact, economics is not just about money maximizing, although we do some of this. Economics is really about developing models of the world that allow us to predict human behavior. That can include things like investing in the stock market, but more interestingly, it can include choices that are more altruistic, and that's charitable giving. So the first premise of this is that behavior is not random. So when I see someone take an action, they didn't just do that at random. Something went into their decision to take that action. And we predict behavior with two kind of very major assumptions. One is that there's some constraints. That's what the individual can actually do, whether it's with their time or with their money. The other is objectives. That's what the individual wants to do. So individuals want to maximize their overall satisfaction, which we often call utility. So you may hear the word utility throughout the talks. Now that's important to kind of separate it this way, because when you then make changes to a person's environment, you can think about whether those changes affect the objectives or the constraints. So something that could affect constraints would include changing the price of charitable giving. That would include changing the matching rates, if you have a matching grant kind of program. Something that might affect the objective, though, would be sending pictures of children in need, changing the way that people perceive your charity, providing some kind of additional information about why you might care about giving because others around you will see that you gave, and social norm kind of questions. So as we think about how to predict behavior, we need to keep in mind these two kinds of components. And behavioral economics is what we use to develop theories to explain these objectives. Now, economics is also founded on the idea of empiricism, which is that we want to test these theories with data. And what we actually want to do is find data on behaviors and not on intentions. We can spend a lot of time in focus groups asking people what it is that they'd like to do. We can ask them in different hypothetical scenarios what it is they will do. But what research tells us is that what people intend to do is often not what they actually do. And what they actually do is what's important for us. So I can ask, actually, I can go and I can run a focus group and I can say, if I recognize Dustin, who's my research assistant here, if I recognize him for the fact that he hasn't slept for some time and has been running these great projects, will that help? Will that make him do more? And he might say, no, I don't care about being recognized. I do this because I'm intrinsically motivated to do it. But then maybe if I point him out here, now he's going to work even harder. He works very hard. But the point is, when we tell people we're going to give them monetary incentives or we're going to give them gifts to do the types of actions we want them to take, often what we find is people will say, no, those don't matter to me. When we put them in the environment to actually make that decision, they do matter. We don't like to think that we're motivated by monetary incentives often. That's one kind of example. So in order for us to really understand how people will behave, we need to put them in environments where they behave in their environment and then see what they actually do. We also care about data on causation rather than on correlation. So it might be interesting to know that people who are healthy also exercise more, but we can't say anything about the impact or the causal effect of exercise on health until we run an experiment. So what we're going to be doing is running experiments to allow us to understand how different changes to the environment actually cause changes to behavior, rather than how changes in environment might be correlated with behavior. And this kind of data, this data on behaviors, that allow us to infer causation is what's going to inform these theories that we've been talking about. So how do we generate this data? The first thing we can do is we can run field experiments. This is my field experiment here. I'm going to hit this guy with an apple. The apple is going to cause this guy to fall down. In order for me to know that really the apple is what's causing this effect, I need a bunch of other guys to whom I don't throw an apple, and I want to see what happens to them. What we want to do with all of you who are practitioners is to partner with you to try to develop different types of interventions or solicitation mechanisms and give them to some people and not to others, and randomly assign who gets which intervention or which solicitation to infer causation, and to look at then the impact on behavior. Look at impact on whether or not you donate, how much you donate, whether or not you volunteer, how much you volunteer. That's field experiments. Field experiments can be noisy. They're also specific to a certain environment. So we try to understand something about donors to benevolent, but we might not know how that then applies to other donors. That's where we can use theory, where the theory actually tells us what it is about the motivation of people that causes them to make the change in response to the intervention that we've developed. The other thing we can do is run lab experiments. We actually have done, this guy, an EEG machine, I think. We've done a little bit on EEG, but that's not really much of what my research is about. My research is laboratory experiments with undergraduate students. The way we do that kind of research is we bring undergraduate students to a lab. They're anonymous to one another. They sit at computer terminals, and we give them some environments in which they actually make decisions. It's quite different from a focus group in that we don't ask people to make hypothetical decisions. We actually have you show up. We give you $20, and then we tell you, you can choose how much to donate of this actual $20 in your hand. And then when people are making decisions, it's as if it's in a real-world environment, because real money is at stake. So incentive compatibility, that's what we call it, is very important. And these are the two types of experiments that you might see talked about today. There will be quite a few field experiments in which researchers have partnered with practitioners to go out into the field and change solicitations and understand behavior. There are also quite a few lab experiments. Lab experiments have pros and cons. So one con you might think of is that university students aren't what we call real people. So we don't think of them as real people when we talk to an audience of practitioners. They're a special group. That's very true, but all people have very similar motivations for what drives them to take certain actions. And through university student subject pools in a very controlled environment, we can actually understand what those motivations are. So rather than thinking about some particular recognition mechanism that a charity might use, we think about what kind of psychological lever does that mechanism drive. So that's lab experiments. The kinds of things you might hear is people will often refer to lab experiment students as subjects, and they'll refer to the different types of interventions that have been run as treatments. And feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like to clarify those kinds of points. So now let me turn to the Science of Philanthropy initiative. So for the past 2 years, and also going into this year, we've had 3 big questions. The first 2 are, why do people give? So what are the underlying motivations that drive giving? One thing that we've really found out more and more is that giving can be self-interested more than it's other regarding. So what I mean by that is people are often quite responsive to different types of solicitations that affect their own well-being than they are about affecting what the effectiveness of the charity is. So things like recognizing people, things like giving them incentives are quite powerful ways to change behavior. And how do people give across the life cycle? So on Saturday, there will be a series of talks where researchers have gone into a lab kind of setting, but instead of using university student subjects, we're using children. So we have children from ages 3 up to 9 and even older, and we're looking at how does charitable giving develop over time, and what are the different types of causal impacts on kids that affects their social preferences. So what is it about the type of schooling you might provide that will affect how people then are generous? What is it about the household inputs or the parents? So both of these types of things are very well answered through these lab-like experiments. We have one very other important question, which is how to increase philanthropy. And that's where we need practitioners more than ever to partner with us to help us predict how individuals will behave in different environments and to provide insights into which environments or which solicitation mechanisms to apply to obtain the desired results. Those are three big questions. You'll see the answers to many of them in the talks today. And we've actually been increasing philanthropy through funding a lot of great researchers to partner with you and to do laboratory experiments as well. So here we have all of the PIs on the projects that we funded just over the last 2 years. You can see that's an incredible number of people, many of whom are here. These are people who are very interested in expanding research in charitable giving and experimentation. What else have we done? We have this great conference. So we've had 140 attendees. We have 10 partnerships, which will be announced later on today. And today we have 200 attendees. And I challenge all of you to form more partnerships so that we can further expand the type of research that we can do in the field. So that's why we have researchers, we have practitioners. We want to be sure everybody is mingling and saying hello to one another and learning about what is it that research can teach practice and what is it that practitioners can teach researchers, because we can learn together. Now I want to tell you a little bit more about our vision for the Science of Philanthropy initiative going forward. We'll be doing a lot of work on charitable giving, as we have been. But what we see here is that right now, if we think about this kind of microcosm of charities, the government, and people, we've been at this front right here. So the Science of Philanthropy initiative has been doing its science on trying to understand how to get people to give to charities. But one thing that's missing here is that now what we want to do is think about how then science can be applied to assist charities in developing the right types of programs to help those people that they serve. And that's a very different question, but much equally important if we think about what is the best way for us to improve the world. And so we believe it's important to match donors to charities which are effective, and we want to know what works. So there's a lot of work now in education and in health and in the environment where we still are unsure what are the right types of treatments or interventions to run in order to improve behavior, in order to improve outcomes, especially for low-income people. And we also know that social preferences, which is what we think of when we talk about charitable giving, and other types of preferences are interconnected. So we have research, myself and some others have done research showing that there's actually negative correlation between social preferences and competitiveness, for example. So people who are more generous to charity tend to be less competitive and vice versa. These are the types of findings that we have when we run experiments trying to elicit preferences, trying to understand how people behave in the world. And then we're in a better position to solve the world's problems if we don't just tackle the fundraising side, but if we also work with these great nonprofit partners to tackle the programming side. So we have some new big questions that we're going to be putting out there as important work for us to work on going forward here. So what motivates individuals to make transformational changes? We now have a lot of programs in which we give food to people that need it. We give educational programs to children who are underperforming in the greater Chicago area. How do we determine what it is about certain individuals and not others that actually drives them to succeed? And how do we develop programs to target things like non-cognitive skills or soft skills that kids might need in order to motivate them to improve? So that's an education example. How does character develop across the life cycle and across cultures? So we've talked already about social preferences and how they develop. We'll have a whole session on that. But what about every other type of preference that we might have? Humans are quite complex. We need to understand more holistically what is going on. And finally, how to use behavioral economics to improve program effectiveness. So that's where we'll reach out to practitioners so that the next conference you can invite not only the fundraisers, but also the people who are developing the programs for the clients that you serve. So why us? Well, first, we're at the University of Chicago. We're experts in economic experimentation. The researcher attendees that are here have done countless work in this area. And second, we already have this great infrastructure. We have great interest from fundraisers, from nonprofits, from researchers to use experimental economic methods and behavioral economic theories, which are the two kind of bases for the work that we do, in order to understand human behavior and charitable giving. And we have actually an early education program on the south side of Chicago that is one of the best at improving educational outcomes of kids. And we want to use that kind of program to understand now how preferences develop over time and how do early education affect preference development. Finally, we have great collaboration. So all of you who have received sub-awards or who come to our conferences or who will be sending us a paper for our new working paper series that we'll launch, all of you are people that we love to work with and want to increase the work in this area. So a couple of next steps I wanted to talk about. In this summer, John and I will be hosting a summer institute on field experiments for junior faculty and PhD students. And we'll be sending out more information about that. But the purpose of that will be not only to introduce young researchers to field experiments, but to introduce them to how to work with practitioners and how to do that in an effective way in order to learn things about, for the research side, but also to bring the research to practice so that practitioners can benefit as well. And we'll be inviting practitioners at the very end of that conference with their ideas to try to change what they've been working on in their programming. And we'll be focusing, of course, on the nonprofit sector, where we have a lot of the great partnerships we have now. We're also developing new partnerships with school districts to try to understand the development of character. And next year's SPI conference will incorporate not only all of this great research on charitable giving, where there remain a lot of unanswered questions, but also a broader range of areas, including in preference development, health, and education. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our presenters. Our first presenter is Terry Zhu. She is at Louis Groceries, and she's a practitioner. She works very closely with Christy Kitzmiller, who's our practitioner partner who makes all of this great work happen. And we have been doing research not only on fundraising for Louis Groceries, which is a nonprofit in the south side of Chicago, but also on how to improve the health of the people that Louis Groceries serves. So we actually have this partnership where we do both of those things, and Terry's going to talk about that. And then we're going to have Michael Price talking about a project that he did together with the state of Alaska on charitable giving to showcase a government kind of collaboration. Finally, if you're interested in these sessions that are not only about charitable giving and social preferences, we have one session on Saturday afternoon called Special Topics, and we're going to have Sally Sadoff there, who I just saw her walk in. We'll be presenting some more work on health. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry. We have some questions for me, maybe, and then Terry will go next. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I really like the hypothesis between social preference and competitiveness, but I'm actually wondering how it relates to like people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett being so competitive, but yet at the end of maybe at the end of their careers, bringing out their pro-social thing. So it's a very interesting hypothesis and. I mean, I would be very interested in evidence, like whether it's the order, first people compete hard and then think about social issues, or vice versa.
So I think that's a great question. I believe that we don't know yet whether preferences are stable over time. And that's one question we are going to try to answer with these studies of how preferences develop across the life cycle. So indeed, it could be the case that you're more competitive first and then you're more pro-social. It could be the case that what's happening in these particular individual situations is that their budget constraint is way out here, so the constraints are much different for them than they are for others, and it may be not a difference in preferences, but a difference in where they are in their spending. I think that the competitiveness charitable giving correlation, so Roman and I have a paper where we found it in the lab experiment. We have people compete in a contest and also give to a public good, and we see a negative correlation in the first period on that. And there's one other paper, I believe, can't recall the co-authors, that have found a similar result. I recently have been interested in the decision to enter into labor markets, so job entry decisions, and I've tried to look at whether telling people that you're working for a nonprofit, so encouraging the social preference side, is going to overcome the fact that many people, and women especially, shy away from competitive workplaces. And we see some of that. So the prediction would be that if you are less competitive, as some women tend to be, that providing this nonprofit component is going to actually help those people the most to choose to enter, because we know that many of the highest earning and highest influence jobs are those with a competitive compensation scheme. Let's see here. Yes, because you're going to give it to Terry. Okay.
Thank you very much. I just have a question about the evolution of SPI toward the programming side, to looking at program effectiveness. What is the connection between philanthropy and program effectiveness? Will you only be looking at programs that are funded by philanthropy? Because there's also non-philanthropic funding of programs as well.
So that's a great question. So we are indeed going to be looking at any types of nonprofits that wish to work with us to understand program effectiveness, not just those that are funded by philanthropy.
So you're going beyond philanthropy and then, in sense, and looking at
beyond, yes.
Okay.
Above and beyond. That's usually our motto.
Hi, Anya. Just a question and some part of a bit of a comment, though. So I'm a frontline fundraiser for my nonprofit. Now, it happens to be a university, but I think I can, in my service to other nonprofits, sort of fits. What is typical of the kind of work that we do is that individual fundraising, the interactions between donors who have the greatest capacity, can wipe out any other sort of annual fund, sort of mailer or whatever. I can just attribute one case where my daughter's daycare was doing a fundraising drive. They were looking for $10,000. They sat across the street from a retirement community. We walked across the street, found one old lady that said, "Sure, I'll give you $25,000." And that, I share that with you because the behavior of those, I guess you can say, the wealthier donors, is something that I think from practitioners' perspective is one that we want greater insights into and an evaluation of practices that will help us in those interactions. And so I share that with you again as an opportunity to partner with researchers who may be able to answer questions around that. I mean, my university is engaging in a $3.75 billion campaign. We know that 95% of the dollars comes from 5%. And it's literally 1,000 gifts will make that campaign, right? So that's our entire efforts, right? And you can sort of, no matter the size of the nonprofit, I think they can understand that 3 or 4 individuals or foundations are going to make the impact around it. So again, I'm sharing that because I think I would love to see more understanding and ways that we can ask the right research questions that sort of address their behaviors and ways that we can then create better strategy around. So if that helps. So
thank you. That's a very good point. So this is an area where we have a lot of unanswered questions, and part of the reason is also because it's hard to find those donors. It's much easier for us to look at cold list donors or warm list donors who have given small amounts. Often when we talk to nonprofits, they withhold the list of warm donors who have given large amounts because these are the people they don't want us to contact with our experiments. So if we are able to have conversations with practitioners around that issue and try to design studies to help us understand the motivations for very high income donors, that would be great. And I think we have a couple of talks at the conference on that very question. So those researchers will be even better equipped to answer your question.
Thanks. I had a question about the extent to which the research that you're talking about draws solely on what you might call retail donors, so sort of regular people who might give, you know, $50 to $100, versus drawing on high net worth individuals or institutional donors, particularly in relation to the competitiveness. You're saying that competitiveness doesn't tally with giving. I just got off a plane from the United Arab Emirates, and in my life I've worked with lots of high net worth people, and I can tell you for a fact that a lot of them give for very competitive reasons. So I heard a story the day before yesterday about Sheikh Mohammed, who is the ruler of Dubai, who decided that he wanted to have a foundation. He did a fundraising drive. It raised $480 million in 6 weeks, and then he matched it himself, like you do. And I mean, look how Dubai works, right? It was pretty obvious what he was doing there. And The Economist had an article about 2 years ago about how many rich donors give in a kind of peacock strategy. You know, look, I can give $500 million and still be rich. So the director of Sheikh Mohammed's foundation was saying to me, it was very clear that he wanted that foundation to be #1. And I said, what, do you mean #1 in terms of size, or in terms of the first one into its area of activity, or in terms of effectiveness? And he just said, #1. So you know, with that in mind, I just wanted to understand, when you talk about these data, whether they are, it's hard to get sheikhs into a lab, I imagine. So I wonder the extent to which your research is looking at retail donors, from whom most dollars come, so that's not unreasonable, versus, you know, maybe there are other sectors which behave differently.
So you're right, I've never had a sheikh in a lab. But this is a very interesting story, and I think one thing that can be helpful for you to know is that we do have a lot of research in lab experiments in which we use university student subjects, and when we put them in environments where they can compete with others to fundraise for public goods, we have people competing in that fundraising setting. We also see similar motivations. So the types of motivations that drive rich people to give are often also mirrored in lower income university students when they are in a laboratory with money at stake. We also see a similar kind of result for reputational concerns. So when we recognize people for their donations, we observe that indeed they give more. And this is something that's what we kind of call a self-interested reason for giving. So you're giving not because you have deep insights about the charity, but because you feel better when you give. And actually, Roman Sharmet is going to talk a little bit about lab experiments in recognition, I think, either today or tomorrow in the talks. So now I'm getting kicked off, but we have Terry, who will be taking over. So thanks very much.